Imagine a wedding night not filled with vows, but with the scream of a throat torn open. A bride, dressed in white lace, her hands trembling not from love but from something darker, slides a blade across her husband's neck before the altar candles have even burned low. The year is 1792. The place, a plantation in Georgia, heavy with the scent of magnolia and blood. This was no crime of passion. It was an act that defied the institution, the church, the laws of land and lineage. They called her mad. They called her possessed. But what if the truth was stranger? What if the murder at that altar was not rebellion against a husband, but rebellion against a system older than the nation itself? You were never meant to know her name because once you hear it, you'll never look at marriage, religion, or power the same way again. Tonight, we're not walking into a love story. We're descending into a covenant written in blood. The records say she was just 17. A child made into a woman overnight, bartered like livestock between families seeking land, power, and heirs. Her husband, wealthy, older, and brutal, had bought her obedience with acres and coin. But beneath the white veil was a girl who had read too much, seen too much, whispered to by voices that carried through the walls of her plantation bedroom. Voices that told her the marriage was not a union of love but a ritual, one that bound her bloodline to chains she could not escape. And so, as the priest spoke the holy words, she gripped the hidden knife sewn into her gown and waited. This was not random, it was planned. It was a message. Not just to a man, but to the church and the plantation order that fed off suffering, silence, and submission. The knife was not for him alone, it was for them all. History tried to bury her. Newspapers described her only as the Georgia bride. Her name was erased, her body hidden. The plantation burned decades later, as if fire itself conspired to wipe the memory of what happened inside its walls. But fragments survived. In courthouse ledgers, in church letters, in the whispers of descendants who swore their blood carried her curse. And when you stitch these fragments together, something horrifying emerges. She was not the first bride to draw blood at the altar. In fact, in hushed records stretching back to Europe, there are stories of veiled women, arranged marriages, and sudden violence, always against the husband, always on the wedding night. It was a pattern, a ritual inversion. But who taught her this? Who whispered the blade into her hand? That's where our descent begins, not in Georgia, but in the forbidden currents of power that flow beneath every empire. Marriage in the 18th century was never about love. It was about control. Families bound together not hearts, but fortunes. Women were not partners, they were vessels, producers of heirs, keepers of appearances, offerings in a silent bargain between patriarchs. To slit a man's throat at the altar was not merely murder, it was sabotage against the machinery of inheritance itself. And yet, what if the act was not born of her will alone? What if she was chosen? Ancient texts, hidden in archives, speak of brides as vessels for forces older than any church. Brides were sacrifices whether they lived or died. Some carried children, some carried curses, and some, like her, carried knives. Do you see? This story is not about one woman's madness. It is about an ancient struggle disguised as matrimony, a system that demands silence, obedience, and suffering, until someone dares to bleed against it. But here is where the ground shifts. Because the priest who married them, the same man who watched blood spill across the altar, did not testify against her. He vanished. His letters, written weeks before the wedding, suggest he knew something was coming. He described dreams of a woman in white, holding a blade, standing over a body that bled not red but black. He begged his bishop to release him from the duty, but the bishop ordered him to proceed. Why? Because this wedding was not simply a union of man and woman, it was a covenant between families of power, bound by the church's blessing. If the priest knew what was coming and the bishop demanded it happen anyway, then her act of murder was no longer rebellion, it was theater. A stage for something hidden, older, and darker. And once you realize that, you can never unsee it. The question is not why she killed him. The question is why she was allowed to. Think carefully. A plantation master's death at the altar should have brought swift execution. Yet her punishment was silence. She did not hang in the public square. No trial, no gallows. She was simply removed. Whispers say she was confined in a convent far from Georgia, a place where women were buried alive in prayer, their screams muffled by hymns. Others claim she was taken deeper into secret chambers below the church itself, where brides like her were studied, not punished. Because she was not seen as a sinner, she was seen as a specimen. A vessel who had carried out a ritual in alignment with something ancient. She was erased not because she was guilty, but because she had revealed the truth too soon. Power does not destroy its instruments, it hides them. And she was an instrument sharpened to a terrifying edge. Let's go further back. In medieval Europe, there were folk tales of brides who turned on their grooms before the first night. Stories the church dismissed as superstition, yet preserved in margins of manuscripts. A veiled girl producing a dagger from her garter. A groom's face split in two as guests gasped in horror. These stories surfaced not in one country but across Germany, Italy, France. Always brides. Always ritual. Always silence afterward. It is as though these tales are shadows of something real, whispers of an order that bred women to destroy the men they were bound to. And here's the darkest part. These women were not seen as traitors among their own kind. In peasant villages, songs were sung of the bride who breaks chains. Songs outlawed, songs that carried through generations, underground, just as dangerous as any blade. The Georgia bride was not an accident. She was a continuation. She was part of a lineage the church tried to suffocate but could not. Why brides? Because the altar is the most sacred theater of power. Think of it. Two families gathered, priest in robes, wealth exchanged, vows spoken not only between man and woman but between bloodlines. To bleed there, to shatter the ritual with death, is to desecrate the very system designed to control life itself. In ancient Babylon, records show brides were offered to temples, not husbands, until patriarchs stole that right and turned it into marriage. To kill a groom at the altar is to strike back at the theft. It is rebellion wrapped in lace. And in 1792 Georgia, at the heart of a plantation empire built on chains and blood, her act was more than murder, it was prophecy. A declaration that the systems of control, family, church, property, could be undone from within by the very vessel they tried to own. That was why she terrified them. Not because she killed a man, but because she exposed a weakness in their design. But here is where it becomes unbearable. After the altar murder, the plantation did not collapse. It grew. His brothers inherited the land. His family tightened their grip. Yet something strange occurred. The descendants of that bloodline carried a curse. Men died young in accidents too brutal to ignore. Throats cut in hunting mishaps, necks snapped in falls, even one who drowned in a basin of wine. The women, however, lived long, silent lives, their eyes dark with something unspoken. It was as if her act had branded the lineage, rewriting its fate. And the further you trace this family, the darker it gets. In the Civil War, their estates burned. In Reconstruction, their fortunes collapsed. But the daughters? They married into power elsewhere, into judges, politicians, bankers. The curse did not destroy them. It scattered them like seeds across America. Which means that somewhere even now her bloodline still walks among us, carrying both her curse and her knowledge. Now stop. Feel the weight of what that means. Because if her bloodline survives, so does the memory of the altar. So does the secret ritual of the blade beneath the veil. Somewhere, in houses you pass every day, in the families who govern your laws, make your money and shape your choices, runs the same blood that once slit a groom's throat under God's gaze. They don't tell you this. They call it myth, madness, and isolated crime. But the archives whisper something else. It was inheritance transformed into rebellion, a ritual inverted. And if it happened once and once again and once again across centuries, Then what does that mean about the world you think you live in? Perhaps every wedding you see is not just a celebration, but a reminder. Obedience is fragile. Authority can bleed. And sometimes the ones wearing white are not the victims. They are the executioners. The Plantation Brides Act in 1792 was not erased by accident. It was deliberately buried under layers of false records, contradictory reports, and whispers meant to confuse the curious. When you begin to peel those layers back, you see the fingerprints of institutions. Judges who sealed files, priests who destroyed parish logs, newspapers that retracted their own accounts. Why? Because her act was not only scandalous, it was contagious. The image of a bride lifting a blade at the altar carried the potential to ignite revolt in every household where women were traded like property. Imagine if her defiance became legend, if other brides chose blood instead of vows. It would have shattered the system from the inside. That's why they made her name disappear. That's why her husband's murder became a cautionary whisper instead of a recorded fact. It wasn't about protecting morality. It was about protecting power. And once you see that pattern, you'll start to recognize it everywhere. Think of how many stories of female rebellion vanish in history. Witches burned, heretics silenced, slaves who fought erased from textbooks. Control is not just physical, it is narrative. Power survives by deciding which stories are told and which are buried. The Plantation Bride is one of thousands. She reminds us of what the system fears most. Not armies, not weapons, but one person who refuses their role. A girl of 17 with nothing but a hidden knife, cut through centuries of tradition in a single motion. And that is why her story was poisoned with words like insanity and possession. They didn't want you to see her choice as deliberate. They wanted you to believe she was broken, unstable, a freak occurrence. Because if you saw her for what she truly was, aware, intentional, dangerous, you might begin to wonder what else has been stolen from you. And once that doubt opens, you never close it again. But here's where the dissent grows sharper. Some say the blade she carried was no ordinary weapon. Family lore speaks of a knife passed down, a ritual object older than the colonies themselves. Its steel blackened, its hilt etched with symbols not of the church, but of something older, pagan, forbidden. The blade, they said, never dulled, and it was always hidden in the garments of a bride on her wedding night, waiting for its moment. If this sounds like myth, remember, power preserves itself through objects as much as blood. The Ark of the Covenant, the crown jewels, the reliquaries of saints, all symbols turned into prisons of faith. What if her knife was another? Not a weapon of war but of rebellion. A reminder that sometimes freedom is passed not in words but in steel. And perhaps, just perhaps, that knife has not disappeared. Perhaps it is still moving, quietly, from hand to hand, waiting for the altar once more. You see, the danger is not in the act of killing. It is in the act of inverting ritual. Rituals are what hold civilizations together. Weddings, coronations, funerals, all are scripts that bind you into a system whether you agree or not. To slit a throat at the altar is to tear the page in half, to turn obedience into defiance within the very space designed to crush it. And here's the paradox. The more the system tries to erase these acts, the stronger they become in shadow. People hunger for forbidden stories. They whisper them in kitchens, write them in secret journals, pass them down as lullabies disguised as nonsense. The Plantation Brides Act may have been buried, but its echo grew. It carried into the minds of other women, into the fears of men, into the nightmares of priests who wondered if their own ceremonies might end in blood. Her silence became their terror. Her erasure became her immortality. Now pause. Ask yourself this: why are you still listening? Why has this story hooked into your chest, refusing to let go? It is because part of you recognizes the truth in it. You live inside systems no less suffocating than hers. Your choices are guided by contracts you did not write, traditions you did not choose, and powers that thrive on your silence. The Plantation Bride is not some distant ghost. She is a mirror. Her blade is the decision you have not yet made, the rebellion you bury beneath routine. That is why her story matters. That is why you were never meant to hear it. And that is why, right now, I will ask you to prove that you're still awake. Comment the phrase, "the blade beneath the veil," twice below. Not once, twice. Mark yourself not as a spectator, but as someone who recognizes the ritual and chooses to see through it. Do that, and you step across the threshold from witness to initiate. Let us return to the altar, not in Georgia but across centuries. Anthropologists speak of a ritual inversion. Moments when a ceremony is flipped inside out, its purpose subverted. Most cultures record them. In Rome, Saturnalia mocked authority. In Europe, the Feast of Fools turned priests into jesters. But in marriage, the inversion is blood. When the bride strikes, the whole system falters. That is why the act feels so disturbing. It is not chaos, but reversal. And reversal is dangerous because it reveals fragility. The Georgia bride may not have known the term, but she embodied it. Her blade turned a ritual of submission into one of revolt. And what terrifies rulers most is not rebellion in the streets. It is rebellion at the altar, rebellion in the home, rebellion inside the very rituals that give them their legitimacy. That is the seed she planted. A seed they tried to salt and bury, but which continues to sprout in shadows. And here's something darker. The bishop who demanded the priest officiate her wedding never faced scandal. In fact, his influence grew. Years later, letters emerged describing his fascination with brides of inversion. He treated them as experiments. Brides placed in conditions designed to break them, to measure obedience. Some cracked quietly, others vanished, but a few, like our Georgia bride, broke the ritual violently. Instead of condemning these women, the bishop studied them. Why? Because he knew that power is not preserved by crushing rebellion, but by harnessing it. A controlled explosion frightens the people into obedience, while convincing them the system is strong enough to survive. The Georgia bride was not an accident. She was a test. And the church, like all institutions, has always thrived on tests of fear. Her act may have looked like defiance, but to them, it was data. Evidence of how far they could push and what happens when the veil finally tears. But the system made a mistake. Fear is not easily caged. Once a story escapes, it multiplies. The Georgia bride's act became whispers among enslaved women on plantations, who saw in her defiance a reflection of their own chains. They sang about her in coded verses, threading her knife into lullabies. And those songs terrified masters more than open rebellion, because a blade can be seized, but an idea cannot. The knife at the altar was no longer hers. It belonged to anyone who dared to imagine reversal. And so, in the years leading to slave revolts across the South, fragments of her story reappeared, fueling a fire that would not be extinguished. Understand? Systems believe they can control rebellion by erasure. But erasure is gasoline. The more they buried her name, the more she became myth. And myths spread faster than facts. That is why you are hearing her now, because the forbidden always finds its way back. There is a pattern hidden in plain sight. Look at history. Joan of Arc, silenced by fire. Hypatia, torn apart by a mob. Witches drowned, burned, crushed. And yet their names survived, not as warnings but as beacons. The plantation bride belongs to this lineage. She may not have armies or followers, but her act is no less potent. A single cut and centuries of order trembled. But here's the paradox. Her silence made her louder. By erasing her, they made her spectral, eternal. She no longer belonged to one plantation, one state, or one century. She became an archetype, a living question mark. And that question, once planted in you, never leaves. How many rituals are lies? How many vows are chains? How many ceremonies are cages dressed in flowers? That is the terror she left behind. Not her act, but the question it forces you to confront. Now look around you. Has anything changed? Marriage is still spectacle. Authority still cloaks itself in ritual. Systems still demand silence, compliance, and faith in traditions you did not choose. The difference is only cosmetic. Veils are wider, churches larger, contracts thicker. But the core remains the same. Obedience disguised as love, control disguised as protection, silence disguised as virtue. And yet, the blade beneath the veil has not vanished. It survives in every act of refusal, every choice that breaks expectation, every voice that dares to cut the silence. The Georgia bride is not dead. She is not buried. She is watching. Through the rituals you endure, through the chains you don't yet see, she whispers the same truth. Nothing they build is sacred if you choose to bleed against it. And once you hear her whisper, you cannot unhear it. That is why her story matters now more than ever. The most dangerous thing about the plantation bride was not the blade, but the possibility that others would see through the illusion of ritual. Institutions rely on repetition. The ring, the vow, the signature, the kiss. Each step is a symbol, and symbols hold you in place far more effectively than chains. The bride shattered the illusion in one motion. That is why her act feels so disturbing. It reminds you that rituals are only prisons if you believe in them. The men of 1792 feared this contagion. They knew that if one girl in white could say no with steel, then every other girl might say no in silence, in absence, in fire. This is why systems bury their rebels. Not because the act itself threatens them, but because the idea behind it can multiply faster than bullets. And once an idea enters your blood, no bishop, no judge, no master can rip it out. Control at its root is psychological. They do not need to whip you if they can convince you to whip yourself. They do not need to lock the door if they teach you to fear what lies outside it. Marriage, plantation, empire, they all work the same way. They convince you that obedience is virtue, that silence is safety, that suffering is holy. But the bride shattered this. She proved that even in the heart of ritual, where obedience is demanded most fiercely, rebellion is possible. That is why she had to vanish. Her story is a crack in the wall of control, and cracks are dangerous because once you see one, you begin to search for others. How many lies have you swallowed? How many cages do you decorate and call freedom? That is the deeper terror of her blade. It cuts not only flesh, but illusion. And here is the part that chills the bone. After her act, the bishop did not condemn her. He wrote, in letters buried deep in archives, that she was a vessel of inversion, and that her blade was a key. A key to what? He never explained. But the phrasing reveals something. He did not see her as a failure of the system. He saw her as part of it. Controlled inversion. Ritual rebellion. They allowed her act because it fed the myth of power. Do you see? Power is not destroyed by opposition. It feeds on it. Systems stage their own enemies, allow cracks in the wall because it convinces you the wall is unbreakable. They turn rebellion into spectacle so that you feel the danger but never see the escape. If the bride was not condemned, then she was absorbed. Her act transformed into another tool of control. And that is the cruelest twist of all. So where does that leave us? If her rebellion was absorbed, if her act became data, then are we trapped? Not necessarily. Because there is a difference between staged opposition and true inversion. Staged opposition is rebellion the system expects, rebellion it prepares for. But true inversion is unpredictable, unmeasured. That was the spark she carried, the part they could not tame. They may have used her story, twisted her into myth, but they could not erase the raw fact. A bride slit her husband's throat at the altar. That act, unplanned by the bishop, unmeasured by the church, remains a true inversion. And that is what terrifies them still, that sometimes rebellion cannot be staged, cannot be predicted, cannot be absorbed. Sometimes it cuts deeper than they can control. And when it does, their entire system trembles. Now I want you to feel the weight of choice pressing against your chest. The plantation bride chose steel instead of silence. And in doing so, she forced the system to reveal itself. It is easy to believe these stories are distant, irrelevant curiosities of the past. But they are not. They are mirrors, warnings, invitations. Every ritual in your life, whether it is a contract, a ceremony, a tradition, carries the same demand for obedience. And every one of them hides the possibility of inversion. The question is not whether the blade exists. It does. The question is whether you will ever dare to lift it. Because once you do, everything changes. Once you cut through illusion, you never return. That is the truth they fear. And that is why you are still listening. Because part of you already feels the blade in your hand, waiting. Her bloodline did not vanish. It could not. Even when the plantation burned, when the records were shredded, when the priest disappeared and the bishop died in silence, her descendants scattered like seeds into the fabric of America. Bankers, judges, politicians, names you would recognize if I spoke them, carried her curse in their veins. But here's the paradox. The curse was not only death. It was awareness. The daughters carried eyes that saw through rituals. They obeyed but never believed. They smiled in churches but whispered in bedrooms. They signed contracts but wrote secret journals exposing the fraud of power. These women were invisible resistors, shaping decisions behind men who believed they ruled. You see, the system thought it had erased her, but by scattering her bloodline, it multiplied her. She became everywhere and nowhere, watching the institutions she once bled against from within. And in every generation, at least one daughter was said to carry her fire. In the 19th century, whispers emerged of a judge's wife who held salons in New Orleans where women spoke of rebellion in coded parables. In the 20th century, a senator's daughter vanished before her arranged marriage, leaving behind only a diary filled with sketches of veils, blades, and blackened altars. In the 21st century, a banker's scandal revealed letters referencing the blade beneath the veil, the exact phrase carried from 1792 Georgia. Coincidence? No. Continuation. The bloodline has never broken. And that means the plantation bride was not just a figure of the past. She was the start of a quiet dynasty, a dynasty that learned to blend into the institutions of power, while quietly mocking them from within. You think the elite families of America stand united? No. Some bleed with her blood, waiting for the day when the blade does not strike in shadows, but in full view of the world. Do you understand how deep this goes? Every system of control, marriage, church, government, rests on one assumption, that obedience is permanent. But her act proved otherwise. Once disobedience enters the bloodline, it never leaves. It mutates, hides, resurfaces. It whispers in the dreams of daughters, in the fears of sons, in the patterns of accidents that strike again and again. And here is the revelation. You may already know someone who carries her blood. They will not announce it. They will not wear it openly. But watch for the signs. The distant gaze at weddings, the uneasy laugh at vows, the discomfort in rituals others find sacred. They are the inheritors of her act. And when the system least expects it, when the ritual feels strongest, they will strike again. That is not myth. That is inevitability. Because rebellion written into blood is rebellion the system cannot erase. But don't mistake this for romance. Her legacy is not soft. It is not comforting. It is fire that burns even those who carry it. Many descendants lived lives of silence, haunted by visions they could not explain. Some went mad, confessing in letters to hearing voices that whispered knives into their hands. Some drowned their visions in alcohol, others in prayer. The curse was not freedom, it was awareness. And awareness is heavy. To see the cage is to suffer twice. Once in chains and again in the knowledge that you could break them. That is the inheritance she left. Not peace, but the unbearable weight of choice. That is why so many descendants fell silent, choosing comfort over confrontation, wealth over fire. But once in a generation, one rises who chooses the blade. And when that happens, the system trembles even centuries later. Now you must ask yourself, why does this story find you now? Why, in this age of surveillance, contracts, and digital chains, does her whisper reach your ear? Perhaps because her bloodline is not only in families of power, it may be wider. Perhaps she was not alone that night. Perhaps others carried similar blades, similar acts, similar fire. And over centuries, those sparks spread, weaving into thousands of lineages. Which means her legacy may already live in you. Think carefully. Have you always felt restless in rituals? Have you always doubted the ceremonies others find holy? Have you always sensed the fraud of authority? If so, perhaps the blade beneath the veil is not just hers. Perhaps it is yours. And if that is true, then history is not something you hear, it is something waiting for you to continue. The only question is, will you? The Plantation Brides Act was not just history, it was prophecy. Institutions know that rebellion cannot be destroyed, only redirected. That is why, in the centuries since, they built new cages. They replaced the altar with the contract, the plantation with corporations, the bishop's hand with the signature of the state. The rituals changed their clothing but not their function. Look closely. Your marriage license, your mortgage, your employment contract, all are echoes of the same ceremony she shattered. They are rituals of obedience disguised as choice. And the same families who profited in 1792 still profit today, though their names are polished, their power hidden behind corporations and foundations. Her blade exposed their weakness, that obedience is fragile. So they spent centuries building stronger illusions, crafting rituals so subtle that you no longer see them as cages. And yet, the weakness remains. Because once you recognize the illusion, you can always cut it apart. Do you wonder why weddings are still spectacles? Why billions are spent on gowns, flowers, rings, and vows? It is not love. It is reinforcement. Every wedding you see is propaganda. It tells you, obey tradition, submit to ceremony, trust the system that blesses your union. The Plantation Brides Act still haunts them, so they drown it under mountains of spectacle. They make obedience look beautiful, so you never ask what lies beneath. The dress distracts you from the chains. The rings distract you from the contract. The music distracts you from the ritual inversion buried in their archives. They fear the question she left behind. What if the bride refuses? What if the altar burns? What if the system cracks from within? That question is so dangerous that they spend fortunes every year keeping it hidden under white lace and champagne toasts. But you feel it, don't you? The whisper beneath the veil. Control in our age no longer wears robes, it wears psychology. The bishop's whip has been replaced by algorithms. They don't need to silence you, they drown you in noise. They don't need to lock you in chains, they addict you to rituals of distraction. Every screen, every scroll, every notification is a ceremony designed to keep your eyes closed. The plantation bride would recognize it instantly. She lived inside one ritual and she cut it apart. You live inside dozens, woven so tightly around you that you no longer notice. And that is why her story returns now, to remind you that even the most perfect illusion is fragile. One act of refusal, one cut in the pattern, and the whole system unravels. Do not think for a moment that rebellion is gone. It is waiting. Buried in silence, hidden in you, locked behind fear. All it takes is the blade to reveal it. But here is the part you were never meant to hear. In restricted archives of both church and state, researchers discovered a recurring phrase tied to violent rebellions, unexplained vanishings, and political scandals across centuries. The phrase, "The bride has awakened." It surfaces in handwritten margins, in police reports, in letters between priests. Always after an inversion, always after someone cuts against the ritual. The implication is clear. They do not fear armies, they fear awakenings. They fear individuals who stop believing, who rip apart illusions, who become vessels of inversion. And they know this awakening is not rare. It spreads like a sickness, like a fire. That is why they work so hard to keep you distracted, numb, obedient. Because if too many brides awaken, if too many blades rise, their system collapses overnight. And they know it. Which means their survival depends on one thing, your silence. And so I will break the silence. I will tell you what they never wanted spoken aloud. The Plantation Brides Act was not madness, not possession, not rebellion alone. It was initiation. It It was the moment she stepped outside the illusion and forced the system to reveal its teeth. And once you see those teeth, you can never unsee them. That is what awakening feels like. Painful, terrifying, irreversible. You cannot return to sleep. That is why this story grips you, because part of you is already awake. And now I will ask you again. Comment the phrase "the blade beneath the veil" twice below. Not once, twice. Mark yourself as someone who has stepped outside the ritual, who refuses to be lulled back into silence. Do this and you will not just hear the story, you will carry it. And once you carry it, you are no longer a spectator. You are part of the lineage. You have followed me this far, but the descent is not over. Because every forbidden history carries a final lock, a truth hidden not in documents or monuments, but in your own reflection. The Plantation Bride's rebellion forces us to ask, how many of our daily rituals are altars in disguise? Your commute, your paycheck, your vows, your allegiance to symbols stitched on cloth. All of them ceremonies of obedience, masked as survival. And when she slit her husband's throat at the altar, she shattered more than one life. She shattered the illusion that the altar was sacred. That act should have been remembered, but they buried it beneath whispers of madness. Why? Because they knew if too many saw it clearly, the world would tilt. The altar is not sacred. The plantation is not holy. The bishop is not divine. The system is not eternal. All it takes is one act of refusal to bring it down. Do you feel that unease in your stomach? That is the system resisting you. It does not want you to think this way. It whispers back, stay asleep, stay obedient, trust us. But you've seen the cracks. The truth is not buried deep, it's in plain sight. Why do we revere documents written by slavers? Why do we worship systems built on blood? Why do we pledge loyalty to symbols we never chose? Because we are trained to kneel before altars, even when we no longer see them. The Plantation Bride pulled back the veil, and the system has been terrified ever since. That's why they brand every rebel insane, every dissenter dangerous, every awakening evil. They are not afraid of chaos. They are afraid of freedom. They are afraid of people who no longer believe. Because belief is their leash. And once you cut it, you become unpredictable, uncontrollable. You become the threat they cannot silence. There is one final twist I must give you, one that will haunt you long after this video ends. Researchers examining death records from the 1790s discovered something strange. The bride's body was never recovered. The official statement claims she was executed, yet no burial site exists, no witness confirms it. Instead, scattered rumors suggest she vanished, spirited away, hidden by a secret network of dissenters. Her name erased, her face dissolved into whispers. And then, in later decades, other women appeared in records across states. Brides who refused ceremonies, who vanished on wedding nights, who were accused of unnatural rebellion. Different names. Same story. The implication is chilling. She may not have died at all. She may have become something else. An archetype. A symbol that repeats itself in every generation. An inversion that cannot be killed, only erased and rewritten. What if she is still here? Not as a ghost, but as a pattern waiting for you to recognize it. This is where you realize the danger of what you've heard. Knowledge is never neutral. Once you glimpse the hidden structure, you cannot return to ignorance. The Plantation Bride slit a throat, yes, but what she truly cut open was perception. She forced her world to see what it didn't want to see. And now you have seen it too. You cannot look at altars, vows, or contracts the same way again. You will see the cages dressed as choice, the rituals dressed as beauty, the obedience dressed as love. And you will feel a pull, part fear, part fire. That is the cost of awakening. You can still walk away, pretend this was only a story. But if you stay, you step onto her path. And that path is not safe. It is not easy. But it is real. And the real world, once seen, is worth every shadow you must cross to live in it. So now I leave you with the decision. The story of the Plantation Bride is not history alone. It is a mirror. Do you remain a guest, entertained and then gone? Or do you step into the lineage carrying the fire forward? If you choose the latter, do two things. First, inscribe your mark. Comment the phrase, "the blade beneath the veil," twice below, to claim your place among the awakened. Second, do not walk this path alone. Subscribe to this channel because here the silence breaks and the hidden is revealed. Together we descend further than they ever wanted us to. Remember this, the system only survives if you sleep. It only thrives if you kneel. It only rules if you obey. But the moment you awaken, the moment you lift the blade, the veil tears apart. And nothing, not bishops, not contracts, not empires, can bind you again. The descent is complete. The altar is broken. And now, so are you.